Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade about the big topic in trade this year, tariffs. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Chartered Institute, and it's great to see so many of you joining today's session. For those of you who are new to our webinar program, welcome along, and for anyone returning, welcome back. If you are new to the Chartered Institute, just by way of introduction, we are the foremost association for importers, exporters, and supply chain professionals with a mission to empower global trade by equipping businesses and individuals with the expertise needed to trade compliantly, sustainably, and profitably. But on the next slide, please. On today's webinar, we will be discussing how the Trump administration's tariff war could affect global supply chains, including some introductory guidance on what businesses and trade professionals can do to mitigate these impacts. If, after the webinar, you find yourself needing a bit more information or guidance on how to navigate the growing volatility in global trade, we certainly recommend checking out our new tariffs hub on export.org.uk, which you can scan the QR code on screen to access. You will see there many ways in which you can gain expertise and support to build your strategy for navigating tariffs, including training courses on how to use free trade agreements to find new sources of suppliers or markets to export to, and also some other training courses that support you in adapting to tariffs. There's member-exclusive webinars on rules of origin compliance requirements, including specific events for the manufacturing and food and drink sectors. And there's hands-on advisory support with one of our industry-leading experts, through which you can get strategic and compliance advice bespoke to your business's needs. We'll also post a link in the chat shortly, and we'll bring the QR code on screen at different points throughout today's webinar. But back to today's webinar. On the next slide, please, Benji. Let's introduce our speakers and talk through today's running order. I'm delighted that we're joined by one of the leading experts on tariffs and free trade agreements, Garima Shrivastava, who will be delivering a couple of introductory presentations on the ongoing trade war and how firms can navigate the effects of tariffs. Garima is our international trade legislation senior advisor at the Chartered Institute and leads the delivery of a number of our customs compliance courses and services. On the next slide, you'll see that we've also brought together a fantastic panel to discuss today's key themes and hopefully help answer some of your questions too. Sophie Levies joins us from Flora Food Group, one of Europe's leading producers and brands for margarine, food spreads, and plant-based foods. Sophie is also a member of the Chartered Institute and is Flora Foods Group's European Compliance and Customs Manager. We're also delighted to welcome Sean Maguire and Andy Lenley today. Sean is the Europe and International Director at the CBI, and Andy joins us from the Department for Business and Trade, where he is the Deputy Head of Trade in Goods. But there's a lot to get through today, so on the next slide, I will shortly hand over to Garima for the first presentation. Before I do, one last thing from me. We will be looking to answer some of your questions throughout the session. You can send in your questions or indeed any musings or comments using the GoToWebinar window at any point. Please note, we cannot guarantee we'll get to every question in the allocated time, which is about 45 minutes. If we don't get to your question, do definitely check out that Tariffs Hub. There you'll see other ways we can support you. Finally, a recording of today's webinar, along with a copy of the slides, will be posted onto the Insights section of our website by the end of the week. We'll also email those to you at the start of next week. But that's enough of me to introduce what's happened so far this year. Over to you, Garima.
Thank you, Will. Welcome all to today's webinar on US tariffs. We are literally eating, drinking, and sleeping tariffs. So today we'll try and tackle what tariffs really are, how Trump's policies have evolved in his second term, the ripple effects across the globe, and most importantly, what you can do about it in the UK. So let's begin with the basics. What exactly is a tariff? Next slide, please. So a tariff is essentially a tax placed on imports. So think of it as a toll at the border, except instead of paying to cross a bridge, you're paying to bring in foreign goods. Now, while that might sound straightforward, tariffs can be extremely complex, especially in how they're used politically and legally. At an international level, tariffs are regulated by the World Trade Organization, or WTO, under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is popularly known as GATT 1994, countries commit to maximum tariff levels. what we call bound rates. And these are applied on a most favored nation basis, which means that you can't play favorites unless there's a free trade agreement in place. But tariffs essentially aren't just about revenue, they're about power, influence, and increasingly retaliation. So, for instance, tariffs can be imposed for protection. So a country can say that they want to shield their domestic industries from foreign competition. Sometimes they could take a shape of punishment to retaliate for unfair practices. Or even it could be a bargaining chip like we are seeing today, which is very much the Trump style. And unlike your average tax, tariffs are immediate, so they can affect your pricing, your contracts, and supply chains the moment they come into force. So while tariffs are just taxes on paper, in practice, they're powerful tools with global consequences. And again, we've seen in the last few years, you do need your masterclass on tariffs. Now let's see how tariffs actually work in practice. Next slide, please. So at the WTO level, tariffs are negotiated and committed to in something called a schedule of concessions. So think of it like a menu of maximum rates countries promise not to exceed unless they're using a legal exception like national security or they have a free trade agreement. Now, we'll see country-wise how they implement and work on tariffs. In the United States, tariff policy is mainly enforced by the US Customs and Border Protection. But the power to impose new tariffs often rests with the president under domestic laws. So they have Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which says that you can impose tariffs for national security purposes. Then again, they do have Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, where you could impose tariffs based on retaliation against unfair trade practices. Now, these allow the US to slap tariffs on imports even from allies with little warning and, let's be honest, not much consultation. Now, in the United Kingdom, things have changed post-Brexit. We know we have our own tariff regime called the UK Integrated Global Tariff. And we apply duties under the WTO rules. We have our free trade agreements. We have our autonomous decisions on certain industries. So the HMRC typically administers duties and taxes, but the kind of policy that we're looking at, that comes from the DBT. And in the EU, we know it's all centralized. The Commission manages tariffs under the Common External Tariff, and EU-wide trade remedies apply, which means that countries like Germany and France don't get to set their own customs policies. Now, we've looked at these three countries. What's common across the board? So you can see that tariffs affect the price you pay, the competitiveness of your product, your sourcing decisions. So whether you import avocados or auto parts, understanding tariffs is non-negotiable. Now, let's get into the Trump show, or as I like to call it, tariffs, the sequel. Next slide, please. So the Trump administration, with President Trump coming in for the second term, has made it clear his trade agenda is not just back, it's turbocharged. So he's brought back the same legal tools from his first term, which were typically Section 232 and Section 301, but this time with more confidence and fewer filters. So here's what we've seen so far. So we've tried to capture like 4 major economies and how Trump has heavily imposed tariffs. So a 10% general tariff on all imports from China, which increased to 20% in March 2025. We've seen 25% tariff on most Canadian goods and 10% tariff on Canadian energy exports. And we know that Canada was an ally, and there is a free trade agreement between US and Canada, and still these tariffs were imposed. Next slide, please. Now, coming to the United Kingdom, we saw that the 25% tariff on steel and 10% tariff on aluminum came about, and these were reimposed. And there are also discussions on the digital services tax because Trump feels that the UK tech firms have been heavily disadvantaged because of discriminatory practices against them. And as far as the steel and aluminum tariffs are concerned, they were invoked citing national security concerns. Now, moving on to the EU, we know that they've swept like several products under it, and several products have come about in the EU as well. They're also now planning a retaliation, but sort of 25% tariffs on consumer goods, and there's like 18 billion of US steel and agricultural products have to be impacted by mid-April. And the rationale that we've seen that have been cited by the Trump administration majorly revolve around national security, economic justice, reducing trade deficits, bringing manufacturing back home. Now, whether those arguments hold water under WTO law is another matter, but let's just say that lawyers are busier, and because it's like a high stakes strategy that hits everything from semiconductors to sparkling water. And it's also worth it to understand what kind of products are getting covered for each jurisdiction. So the global message that they do want to send out is, if you trade with the US, you need to be ready for sudden shocks. Now, we'll see the retaliations, of course. Next slide, please. So you can't throw punches in trade without expecting a few back, of course. And retaliations here have been swift and very strategic, I would say. So we'll start with Canada. The US reimposed the steel tariffs, and then Canada responded with its own duties on American-made ketchup, washing machines, and whiskey. And that's not just about economics, that's targeting swing state exports, strategic and salty. Then the UK again saw its steel and aluminum exports being slapped with tariffs. So the UK hasn't retaliated yet, but we're still trying to negotiate any carve-outs diplomatically. So we'll see, something to keep an eye on. The EU went further. In March, it hit back with 25% tariffs on 4.5 billion of US goods, including motorcycles and jeans and bourbon. So they're planning to scale it up as well, somewhere close to 18 billion if no resolution is found. So we'll see what happens with EU. They're trying to really match the tariffs that are being imposed on them. And China, well, no stranger to trade battles, nothing new for them really. They retaliated with tariffs on products like US meat, soybeans, and timber. Their response, of course, is going to be more methodical and escalatory because they've been dealing it for quite some time now. So what is then essentially is happening? What exactly is the result? I can see that we are back in for a tit for tat cycle. WTO cases are flying around. We are seeing disputes coming in every day, sometimes by China, sometimes by the EU against the US tariff imposition. Supply chains are rerouting. Businesses are stuck in the middle trying to figure out which tariff will hit them. So yes, the message is clear. Trade wars don't end with the first tariff, they spiral. And you need a plan before your goods are caught in the crossfire. Next slide, please. All right, so we've looked at how tariffs are used and how countries are fighting back. But let's now zoom out. What are the global challenges that are emerging from all this tariff drama? First, of course, supply chain disruption. So when tariffs are imposed, especially suddenly, businesses have to either absorb the higher costs or pass them on. That's easier said than done, because if you're a UK-based bike manufacturer, for instance, and you're sourcing aluminum frames from the US, a tariff of 10% makes those frames 10% more expensive overnight. So you either raise your prices, switch suppliers, or eat into your margins. I don't think any of those are ideal. The other thing could be rerouting of trade, which we've seen happening. Companies are restructuring supply chains to avoid hotspots. For example, some US electronics firms shifted assembly to Vietnam during the US-China trade war. But again, rerouting isn't just a click and go exercise. It takes time, money, and a lot of legal and customs work. The third thing is there's a lot of uncertainty when tariffs are imposed via national security clauses. They often fall outside normal WTO scrutiny. And this sort of creates a gray area for dispute resolutions. And businesses are left in limbo, asking, can I trust this FTA? Will these duties come back next year? Will these duties be taken back? So again, these sort of questions create uncertainty for everyone. And finally, there's going to be compliance overload, of course. So increased tariffs usually come with added bureaucracy, new customs code, additional documentation, increased security, of course, at borders. So for SMEs, it's often a case of, oh, we didn't even know we had to check that form. So in short, tariffs are no longer just taxes. They're a source of volatility. And for businesses, I think the challenge is to become agile enough to respond without losing competitiveness. And we look into what UK businesses can do, but just in a few minutes. Over to you, Will.
Terrific. Thank you, Garima. It's incredible how much has happened in just over 2 months since Trump's inauguration, since the beginning of tariffs for sequel, as you just said. On the next slide, we're going to run a quick poll just to gauge from you if your business's supply chains have already been affected or not by the volatility that Trump has introduced this year. The options should be on screen. While you're answering that poll, Green, we've had a question in from Robert, who's made the point that you alluded to as well, that tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, they seem to be overriding the fact that it is the WTO which sets rules on tariffs, which the WTO members then follow. So Rob's asking, can countries just ignore WTO rules and impose whatever tariffs they want? How acceptable is that legally, and what is the role of the WTO now?
Yeah, a lot of people are asking the same question, and it sort of gets to the heart of the tension we've seen in the recent months. So, under WTO law, countries do have to follow the rules they've signed up to, like not raising tariffs above their bound rates and treating all WTO members equally under the MFN principle. But the system also recognizes that countries might, in exceptional circumstances, need to take unilateral action. And that is where Article 21 of GATT comes in. It allows members to take measures they consider necessary to protect their national security. Now, Trump's administration used this provision to justify tariffs on things like steel and aluminium, arguing that over-reliance on foreign metals threatened US security. So, of course, it was controversial, especially when those tariffs were applied to allies like the UK and Canada. But it was, of course, done within the framework of WTO rules, just a particularly broad interpretation. And of course, this is not safe from disputes. So countries can definitely not ignore WTO rules, but they do have some legal space to act unilaterally, especially when invoking national security. And which is why other countries are now bringing in trade disputes against the country, because they do want to understand how much can you expand the national security clause.
Thank you, Garima. That's a great answer. I hope that's helpful, Rob. Let's have a quick look at the response to that poll. Very, very interesting, very revealing. 58% of you have already had your supply chain affected by these tariffs. 28% not sure, 14%, only 14% not affected so far. So it's having an effect, to say the least. If we move on to the next slide, though, we're going to go into our first panel discussion, going into the what's going on at the broad high level. So Sean, great to be joined by you. Welcome to today's webinar. Garima's given a great overview there of the current state of play in terms of the tariffs that have been introduced so far. We've increased US tariffs already in play, and the EU and others retaliating. Where can you see this going? And just to kind of add to that, what are the biggest fears that businesses may have about where this is potentially going?
Well, thank you and good afternoon. Well, that is a $64,000 question of where this is going and where it'll end. And I think the short answer is it's going to get worse before it gets better, mainly because the conventional way of resolving issues has been, particularly on the global stage, has been completely replaced by an unconventional route and approach from the United States. And I was in DC 10 days ago, and the narrative and the rhetoric is united that the US has felt that it has been unfairly treated by the rest of the world. There is quite a lot of injustice towards US tech firms, but US companies, and this will all end under the Trump administration, and tariffs is the means by which to bring this all to an end and restore the US position on the global stage. You know, to use a phrase that was used to me a few times, we are going to build a wall first of all and see if we can open doors with partners, but on our terms. And this is where, you know, it becomes even more challenging. What does it mean on our terms? And you know, from a UK perspective, an EU perspective, you know, there are many barriers that we would see operating within the US market, NTBs, like they feel that some of our regulatory regimes in the UK and the EU on Digital Marketing Act, digital sales, SPS is a restriction to US exports. We also have challenges, but the clear line is, you know, you'll get nothing in return. So it's very difficult to see how you end up in any short frame a negotiated outcome where both people can come away, both sides can come away as if they've won, and certainly for the Trump administration to demonstrate that they've won. Now, pressures may come in around inflation and you know, more US businesses speaking up to say that actually it is harming their output and profits as well. But at the moment, it's as I put in my kind of finished note to CBI colleagues after I come back from DC, buckle up for a bumpy ride, and unfortunately that is what we have to appreciate. And this unpredictability is really causing many concerns, even for those companies that have not yet been impacted by tariffs.
Thank you, Sean. A bumpy ride is well, it sounds bumpy. Not the best of words, but yeah, it is what it is, I guess. And Andy, thank you for joining us from the Department for Business and Trade. How is the trading goods team, which you're part of, how are you preparing for possible US tariffs on UK goods, or in more general terms for an increase in global volatility and how that may affect the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Abel. I mean, our day-to-day job is, you know, we're working on UK FTAs. You know, we are seeking to negotiate new FTAs with, you know, India, the GCC, for example. So those are ongoing negotiations. We're working on all our existing FTAs, so maintaining them. We are upgrading some of them, you know, with Switzerland, with Turkey. But this, of course, is a you know, unprecedented situation that we have with the US, and I mean, we are monitoring it very closely. But of course, as everyone else, we are equally affected by the uncertainty around it. We don't know either what the US is going to implement, and you know, there's a wide range of different tariff regimes that they have announced, but whether they will do it, when they will do it, we don't know. There is, you know, the main one that, you know, people are looking at the moment is the reciprocal tariffs that have been announced. Well, an announcement had been made that they will be announced at, you know, I think 1st or 2nd of April. But of course, we don't know what the US findings will be about, you know, the sort of alleged barriers that, you know, say the UK imposes on US imports, or the EU or other countries that might be affected by this, and you know, what tariff rate we might then be facing. And of course, there have been discussions with the US about, you know, trying to avoid any such tariffs. We don't see a need for them, and we appreciate the US has, you know, sees problems about, you know, imbalance in the global trading system, and you know, we certainly, you know, we share some of those concerns. But I mean, the tariffs are not the way to mitigate this. Yeah, but yeah, we work. I mean, we have sector teams working with individual sectors in the UK, and of course we work closely with them, monitoring the situation. And but yeah, it is also huge uncertainty for us. And of course it will affect even if, for example, the UK wouldn't be affected by certain tariffs, it would still, it could affect UK companies that might be producing elsewhere and are shipping to the US. Companies could caught up in retaliatory tariffs, imposed by, the EU, for example. I mean, the UK is not, hasn't announced any retaliation, but there's a whole range of secondary effects that companies could get caught in. So that makes this all very, very complicated, and also could affect a lot of companies that are we are talking about steel and aluminium, and of course these are the tariffs that have been imposed now, but these are sectors that are used to dealing with tariffs, with anti-dumping, so that doesn't make it better necessarily, but this is not as unprecedented for them. But if we had a US tariffs imposed on, say, the UK or the EU or other partners that are flat rates across the board, then you get a lot of exporters caught in those tariffs that are not used to this. Like, at the moment, it's I think about 2/3 of our exports to the US don't face any tariffs. I mean, steel and aluminium aside, I think that is not taken into account here. But most of our exports to the US are MFN 0, and an even higher share of our imports from the US are MFN 0. So the trade between the UK and the US in particular is actually has very, very low tariffs at the moment. And if that changes, then of course it would affect a lot of sectors that wouldn't be as used to dealing with those issues.
I know the UK's been taking what it's called a pragmatic approach, what the government's called a pragmatic approach, by not introducing retaliatory measures yet in terms of steel and aluminium tariffs. There's also been talk of a possible UK deal to get an exemption from any future tariffs, which may or may not come in next month. I mean, in terms of this deal, what sort of deal is the UK looking to strike, and what could it mean for UK businesses, this particular deal? Andy.
I mean, there are discussions with the US, but I mean, what that exactly entails, I won't be able to say. I mean, there's also, this happens at various levels, at higher levels. But I mean, of course, we have made clear to US veto we don't see a need for any such tariffs, and they should be avoided.
And Sean, is there anything that CBI would like to see from any deal with UK strikes with the US? Is it just about getting rid of tariffs, or is there anything else?
Well, ultimately, I mean, the aim should be to avoid tariffs, because if you look at year-on-year trade between the UK and the US, it has grown positively for both parties. So, we shouldn't be looking at tariffs to kind of punish something that is a perceived injustice, whether we may agree with them or not. So I think we need to find a negotiated solution. There are many areas where we can work with the United States, both at federal but also at state level, on defense, on AI, on digital. There's a whole range of possibilities that we would be able to work with. Whether that would be enough for the Trump administration to see a way that they have won and remove the tariffs, but I still think they are using Trump 2 as a means to look at regulation that they feel discriminate against US companies, and that is a big difference from Trump 1. I suppose the other aspect just to bring in here is, while the UK may get a carve out, that may be true, but if the EU retaliates, Northern Ireland would have to apply the EU tariff to US imports. So there is also a kind of UK or GBNI issue to this, even if the carve out for the UK was possible. So none of these things are completely straightforward. But yeah, let's find a solution as soon as possible.
Yeah, the Northern Ireland stuff could get quite complicated. And Sophie, just to bring you in for the final part of this panel, Obviously, beyond steel and aluminium, new tariffs have not been introduced on the UK yet, and yet was it just about 60% of the audience earlier said that they have been affected so far. Have any of Trump's measures affected your border supply chain at this stage, or have there been any other knock-on effects on your business or your suppliers?
Yeah, so being a global manufacturing food company, obviously America is one of our largest regions. We at Flora Food Group were quite proactive, and luckily back in September, we announced that we've acquired a new production site in the US. So we are hoping, if there are any further EU tariffs put in play, any other products affected, this new production site for us will help mitigate that, because it will take away some of the production stress that we have in our main kind of EU manufacturing sites. For everything else, we import and export in the US. So at the moment, it's me and my colleagues sitting down and really trying to dissect between end products versus, production manufacturing that we need to set up factories and all these different things. So it's been a real change on our day-to-day at the moment, because it's not all announced, it's not all confirmed. So a lot of it is trying to get as much research and homework done as possible, with the hopes that it's not needed, but also in the hopes if it is needed, we are covered internally and Flora Food Group can continue as we are. We are lucky that we have, with food at the moment, so aluminium and steel isn't affecting us hugely, but if it does change, also we're going to have to look into, as Garima and yourself mentioned, either changing our routes or changing where we produce, and that doesn't happen overnight. It takes us an extraordinarily long time to get set up. So we are hoping this new production site in the US will be a winner, and before anything really scary comes into play, we will be covered.
Thank you, Sophie. I mean, being proactive, not reactive, always seems good advice, but as you say, these things do just take time when it comes to trade. But thank you to our panelists so far. A lot of great context there about what's happening and how businesses have been affected so far. However, we're also here to learn about what businesses can do next to mitigate for the impact of tariffs. On the next slide, to introduce some strategies for navigating increased trade volatility, I'd like to welcome Garima for the next short presentation.
Thank you, Will. As Sean and Andrea said, it's not just about the UK not attracting any direct tariffs so far. So, of course, we're just seeing steel and aluminum tariffs at this point. But then there are several other factors that play into how trade is being conducted within the UK and its exports. For instance, it could be the unique position of Northern Ireland, or tariffs being imposed on our major trading partner like the EU. So it is going to have ripples in the UK as well, and we are not completely safe from the tariffs that are being imposed across the globe. So what potentially can the UK firms do? The good news is that there are strategies, different kinds of strategies, practical, legal, and operational, to mitigate the impact of tariffs. Next slide, please. We'll look into what these strategies look like. All right, so first up, legal monitoring. And I've been recommending this to all the clients that I'm meeting these days. So you need to have someone keeping an eye on tariff developments. The US laws like Section 232 or 301, and even UK FTA reviews, because it's worth it to be on toes at this point. The companies that I work with typically have subscribed to trade alerts, or they even use certain AI-driven custom software just to track the ongoing changes. Others rely on their in-house customs compliance team or external advisors like us. Either way, knowledge is power, I would say, in these times. And it is also protection, not just power. Secondly, you can have your contract clauses reviewed. So if you're importing goods and a new tariff hits, who absorbs that cost? Smart businesses are now trying to insert a tariff pass-through clause into their contracts. So if duties or tariffs rise, either side shares the costs or gets a way out. So having those terms clear in your contract will go a long way. Then we've got customs compliance mapping. This means now is the time to review your tariff classifications so you know whether your products are getting impacted by a newly introduced tariff. Understanding customs valuation, because ultimately tariffs and duties would depend on the customs value of your product. And of course, rules of origin, because every product is now going to be hit by its origin, which is the economic nationality of the product. So I've seen firms trying to understand their classification processes. For instance, getting into their already existing classification practices and knowing what their product is, if anything has changed in the recent past. And some companies trying to understand their FTA eligibility, their FTA benefits that they are currently claiming, and how things can potentially change. Another big one is scenario planning. And this sounds vague, but I can put that into perspective. Businesses now need to have contingency models for rerouting goods or shifting suppliers. Now, one UK electronics importer that I worked with had built like 3 sourcing models, and they had even got that vetted by us. So they had China, Vietnam, and Poland. So they could switch depending on the tariff impact. And it saved them when China tariffs suddenly jumped to 20%. So the key is being proactive, not reactive. And we've been talking about it. I know Will was just saying proactive is the key. Being proactive is the key. So you don't want to be that business who calls their customs broker the day the tariff hits asking, wait, what's the tariff schedule? So you need to be aware of these concepts about how you're going to potentially apply these different customs concepts and how you can safeguard yourself against some of them. All right, let's move to the next slide. So FTAs, everyone has been talking about free trade agreements, which is one of your strongest legal tools to beat tariffs. FTAs are typically international treaties in the form of contracts between 2 or more countries that eliminate or reduce tariffs between member countries. And we in the UK have over 70 trade agreements in force. So think of them as your express lanes in global trade. Now, let me give you an example. Imagine a UK trader who used to import processed food ingredients from the US and is suddenly hit by a 25% Trump tariff, assuming that food ingredients are also swept under the tariff actions. But under the UK-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, similar ingredients can now be imported duty-free. So you save on costs and reduce dependency on volatile markets. Now, FTAs can also open new export markets and not just import markets. So one of our members at the Institute in agri-food sector started shipping to Canada under the UK-Canada Trade Continuity Agreement when tariffs made US exports uncompetitive. But there's a catch. You only get the benefits if you meet the rules of origin, because any benefits available under these free trade agreements is dependent on the origin of the products. They don't want the benefits to seep out and go to third countries which are not a part of the free trade agreement. And that's why meeting the rules of origin is not just a simple checkbox. It's a whole legal compliance test. So if you get it wrong, you could owe back duties and fines or even face audits. One practical tip from me would be to reevaluate your FTA claims, try and see if you're even claiming for these available FTA benefits, and then invest in your origin documentation systems and have a robust record-keeping mechanism. Also educate your supply chain, including all the stakeholders, your customs compliance team, of course. Again, FTA would be your strategic lifeboat in these times. But again, to sail smoothly, you do need to know the rules of origin and follow them carefully. We'll talk more about rules of origin in our upcoming webinar in this series. But yes, let's move past FTAs for now. Next slide, please. Again, FTAs are great, but they're not just the only silver bullet. And what happens if a country you rely on isn't or doesn't have an FTA with the UK. So there has to be a wider resilience plan that comes in here. The first and foremost thing would be supplier diversification. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. And you know that we're not talking about eggs here. So again, think about diversifying your supply chain. Think about the countries that you can potentially import from and export to. And again, I've worked with different companies. It takes time to build that sort of a diverse supply chain, but once you're through, you know that you have multiple sources to rely on. Second would be nearshoring and friendshoring. So the UK has been encouraging firms to look at Commonwealth countries or partners in Europe or even the Mediterranean region. So, and again, we have the new CPTPP as well. So think about all these other regions where you could get a more tariff efficient deal and to also reduce lead times. Third would be to duty plan. Use other available custom special procedures like inward processing reliefs or customs warehousing, because it's not just about the direct tariff impacts, but it's also about making your overall customs compliance more efficient and claiming that the benefits that are available to you. And lastly, technology. Of course, make use of technology, have duty optimization software, good supply chain mapping platforms. These are not just the nice things to have anymore, they're essential for you. And again, internal skills would also have a role to play. So train your team for sure, educate them, educate your finance department, your customs compliance team about not just FTAs and rules of origin and tariff classification, but also about these special customs procedures, because it's just easy to miss these available benefits. And now is the time to reevaluate if everything that you're doing is actually accurate and the most efficient. So I know you're thinking this is a lot, but you're not wrong. The trade landscape is getting more complex. But the good news is you don't have to navigate it alone. Of course, we at the Chartered Institute do offer practical and tailored training courses to help you. We do have our advisory and helpline as well. And now I'll let Will explain that to you. So over to you, Will. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to Garima. Some really great advice there. We'll come on to our second panel discussion shortly. But indeed, this is just a short introductory and free webinar, and there's only so much we can say in the time we've got today. But on the next slide, if you do need more information or want to upskill in some of the compliance processes introduced by Garima just now, the Chartered Institute has a suite of training courses that may just be perfect for you. You can again scan the QR code on screen to find these courses on our website, export.org.uk. There you will find our Rules of Origin course, where you can learn from experts like Garima about what you need to do to ensure your goods qualify for preferential tariffs through free trade agreements. You can also learn other ways of mitigating the impact of tariffs through our Custom Special Procedures course, where you can also learn about how to streamline your supply chain compliance more broadly. Maybe the Trump-led trade war could force your business to reconsider or refocus on trade with Europe. If so, our Trade with the EU course will help you to do just this. Or you may need to just brush up on how you classify your goods for customs purposes. Our customs classification course is perfect for that. I'll post the link into the chat shortly where you can find more information about all of these courses. But right now, let's bring back our expert panel. And as we do so, we'll quickly launch our final poll as well. So that poll should be launching in a second, asking what percentage of your business relies on exports to the EU. As people answer that poll, let's get going with the panel. Sophie, let's begin with you. Welcome back to the panel. Garima's mentioned the UK's free trade agreements as a possible way to navigate and mitigate the impact of tariffs. Has your business, Flora Food Group, been using or considering using deals like CPTPP to find alternative suppliers or new export markets?
Yes, we use all sorts of free trade agreements currently. It does make streamlining and ensuring that everyone is aware of what's going to happen both sides on export and import of the flow much easier. We are still looking into where we can make use of other free trade agreements that we don't currently use, with obviously being in fresh foods with the margarines and creams. It is something which makes life a lot easier if we can get it straight through and if it can get to market as soon as possible. We are always on the lookout for new export markets. At the moment, we do have several projects, and it's great fun from my point of view, looking into all these trade agreements when you have a colleague ask you the question, is this possible? And I have no idea until I find there is a free trade agreement. As long as we are obviously within the bounds that it outlines, it can make my life a lot easier. So yeah, we've been using them the entire time we've been exporting, and we are looking to expand the usage of them at the moment.
It's nice to hear fun used about trade, given the context of everything we've been talking about. But also, I mean, presumably there are challenges when it comes to using trade deals. We've mentioned earlier, kind of shifting from one market to another just because it's a trade deal. Presumably, it's not that easy and it takes time.
Yeah, it really doesn't take, you know, the week that you hope it would. It always does take a lot longer. For us, well, from my opinion personally, it's ensuring the education of all colleagues involved in any type of international movement. It's not just those of us in the compliance teams or the global export teams who need to know, it's even the sales team on the ground in the importing country. The more people who know what is affecting their products and the way it gets into country makes it a little bit easier. I had a wonderful question about 2 weeks ago where someone said, this commodity doesn't have a preferential rate. We'd have to pay X amount of duty on import. Can we change it to this one? And I had to very politely decline because it was the difference between saying it was a margarine product or a cream product. And they're two completely different things. So clearly I need to jump back on and educate a bit further. And also it's just ensuring, you know, either my team in the UK, our in-house brokers, or whoever we use across the globe are also in line and ready to implement the plan that we wish to use.
Thank you, Sophie. Here's, by the way, very quickly the response to that poll. So less than 10% is for general. So it's less than 10% or up to 25% seems to be the broad percentage of trade with the EU-US. But 14% of you are trading more than 50%. So hopefully this webinar is proving useful to all of those different scenarios. Next slide, we're into the panel. So yeah, next question I've got is for Sean and Andreas and Andy. And this is, you know, we've heard from Sophie how Sophie is kind of preparing to mitigate for the impacts of this new volatility. But how do businesses that you work with at CBI and DBT so far mitigating the effects of volatility in global trade, starting with Andy? Or maybe not, starting with Sean.
Yeah, no, sorry. Up to you.
Sorry,
shall I go?
Yeah, Andy, do you want to come in on that quickly? Just how the firm's kind of DBT is working? What's going on in terms of mitigating for tariffs?
I mean, in general, of course, a bit like, you know, picking up what Sophie was saying, we do try to expand our FTA network, and a lot of this is actually at the moment about you know, deepening existing FTAs, and then, you know, the changes when it comes to trading goods are primarily in agriculture, although that includes processed food. So you know, the tariffs are usually zero in our FTAs for industrial goods, but they're often not zero for a wide range of agriculture and food products.
I don't know if that's just me. Andy, your line's gone a bit, it's broken up a little bit there, I'm afraid. So yeah, it went a bit glitchy, but do you want to say kind of where you were in terms of the deals you're deepening and kind of other ways you're supporting businesses?
Yeah, I was talking about the work we're doing on expanding our FTA network, which includes, you know, deepening existing FTAs, which is then when it comes to tariffs, is then mainly about deepening or having more tariff preferences on agriculture and food products, because the rest is usually already fully liberalized in practically all our FTAs, or is scheduled to be fully liberalized in the next few years. So we are doing this, for example, with Switzerland at the moment. We are planning to start negotiations with Turkey in a couple of months. And you know, Turkey is a major market for the UK. I mean, depends, of course, on the product, but it's one of our largest FTA partners apart from the EU. With, you know, a lot of tariffs remaining on the agricultural side. So we're doing a lot of that. There is, of course, also sort of separate work in other teams looking at specific market access barriers. So these are not normally tariffs, but a wide range of other barriers that might exist in across many of our partner countries. So we're working, or those teams would work closely with the embassies, with the private sector, to address those barriers in particular markets. I think we have a system in place where you could report a barrier. So if if let's say you're exporting something to, let's say, Guatemala, and you're facing, discriminatory taxes or regulatory issues that you think are, are problematic, we are trying to address those problems, and where possible, of course, this is not, we can't guarantee a success, but we are, we are trying to remove those barriers for our exporters. We have a team that looks at sort of advocating the use of our FTAs, so FTA utilization team. So they're doing a lot of work, especially about CPTPP, trying to raise awareness about it, because CPTPP is a good example of, it's a new FTA that we joined, but we already have FTAs with most of the partners, but it still means there's improvements across some products. It also means we have essentially now an FTA with Malaysia through CPTPP, which we didn't have before, and Brunei, rather small, but so we're working on that. We're looking at expanding CPTPP membership in the coming years. So that there's discussions starting soon with Costa Rica to join CPTPP. So we are now part of those discussions, and that's already an FTA partner for us. So the changes are not going to be very dramatic, but as always, it can be small changes that can be fairly important for particular exporters. Yeah, but in terms of what,
Yeah, thank you, Andy. There's a lot of great activity at DPT. The FTA utilisation team as well. We've done a fair bit of work with them at the Institute. It's a great unit there. So great to see so much going on. Just wanted to bring Sean in as well. Sean, because I know you've got a dash in a second, but in terms of the businesses you've been working with at CBI, how have they been mitigating? And is there anything else you'd like to see from organisations like DBT or even bodies like the Institute in terms of supporting for businesses?
Well, thank you. And I mean, most of the all of the panelists have kind of identified the issues that can help alleviate or certainly mitigate some of the effects. But I think if you take it to a more macro level, whatever will happen and for however long, I think we've seen all the reports from Goldman Sachs, from Oxford Economics, global growth will be dampened in the kind of months and years ahead. And as a consequence of that, a lot of the businesses, and we cover the whole range and the whole economy, from financial services to energy to manufacturing to consumer products to agri-foods, there is just that unpredictability in the air, and geopolitics is now a boardroom issue. Where beforehand it would have been an AOB, it is a core boardroom issue, and it's not just the US, it's China, it's shipping straits, etc. There's a whole range of issues that are in, and what is happening is that companies are holding off investment into other areas, whether it's digital, AI, or people. And that is a serious concern across the board. So what I would say to this government is to use other levers in your arsenal, or particularly around boosting the growth agenda. And you have an industrial strategy, have a trade and investment strategy, and I think we need to just move ahead with them pretty quickly, recognizing that the global order has changed, but we can do a lot at home through a more kind of attractive market to invest, to attract that investment, when the rest of the world is grappling with the economic challenges of tariffs. So domestic policies, whether it's on infrastructure, whether it's on green, whether it's on climate, whether it's on life sciences, there's a lot that we can do to boost the kind of image of the UK when we're in this kind of turmoil. So I wouldn't forget all the other reasons why the UK is a good place to do business, and export strategies often start with good, sound domestic strategies at home. So I think for our companies, it's just the lack of predictability is putting a pause button on a lot of investment.
Terrific. We have run over. We've been quite ambitious trying to shorten our public webinars to 45 minutes this year, and I think this is too big a topic to even try that for. But thank you to our fantastic panel. That was a really gripping conversation, and I'm sure this is a conversation our panelists today, but the Institute and various organisations like DBT, CBI, and businesses like Flora Food Group will be having this conversation throughout this year and the coming years, I'm sure. So let's start wrapping up. Thank you again to our speakers in Garima, Sophie, Andy, and Sean for the overview of the impact of the 2025 tariff dispute so far, as well as what traders can do to mitigate the impact of these tariffs. On the next slide, a reminder that we have created, next slide, yeah. We have created a new hub on export.org.uk with resources and educational support to help you and your business navigate this increasingly volatile trading world. On this Tab Hub, which you can access via the QR code or the link in the chat, you can find training courses on how to use free trade agreements to find new sources of suppliers or markets to export to, member-exclusive deep dive webinars on rules of origin compliance requirements, including sector-specific sessions for the manufacturing and food and drink industries, and hands-on advisory support with one of our industry-leading experts through which you can get strategy and compliance advice specific to your business's needs. So do definitely scan what is a fantastic resource for navigating these volatile times. You will also get an email from Camille, our manufacturing sector lead, in the next half hour or so with a link to the tariffs hub page and the opportunity to book a follow-up meeting with her. Camille will be able to answer any of your questions about our courses, qualifications, membership, or advisory services. So watch out for that email and please don't hesitate to get in touch. As we bring things to a close, please remember that the slides and recording of today's webinar are being uploaded to the Insights section of our website, export.org.uk, under the Resources tab. They will be emailed to you next week as well. As you leave, please do let us know what you thought of today's session and any suggestions for our future events by completing the short exit survey. But for now, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for attending and goodbye.